Okay, well, why don't we start? Maybe we'll start with the prayer. And the prayer is from Vijay Seshadri, a great poet, Indian American poet Vijay Seshadri, who heads the nonfiction program parenthetically at Sarah Lawrence, and who has a wonderful book called The Long Meadow, from which one of the poems, one of my favorites, is called Superman Agonistes, and this is Superman talking. When my x-rays look through the humans to the need inside, glowing red and green, my blood cells collide, my lungs collapse, my cortex rebels, and my heart wraps a bomb around itself and threatens to kill us both. But I can't stay away. I have to fly down to watch them pray, to watch them couple, to watch them fight, exposing myself to their kryptonite. As some of you may have not come to the class last week thinking what I had said the week before was true, that I was going to be having surgery, but then it turned out I wasn't having surgery, so then I did do the class last week. So this is in fact the last class. For those of you who I misled, I first of all apologize, but we tried to get the word out that it was happening after all, but also it's available online. All these classes are online on the NYU server. So, but this is the last class, and basically it's a class in which I try to bring all these different themes together that we've been talking about. To recap, the first half was about the first two classes were about the paradox of form and the fictive nature of form, the fact that in fact everything that happens is total chaos, but we can't stand that, so we ask our writers to discover a form in the chaos, or to impose a form, which is the best we can do at the moment. I'm not talking about lying, or I value accuracy, I value transparency and fairness and things like that, but I don't think you can aspire to objectivity. You can just aspire to giving the chaos a sense of form, which is fictive in the best possible sense. And then last week we were talking about the parallel or contrapuntal paradox, that everything that happens exactly the way it had to happen, or would have had to happen some other way. But having said that, as it was happening, and the job of the writer is to worry out all the reasons it happened that way, but while it was happening, everybody involved was free to behave in any other way. And even today, everyone involved is free to assume an attitude toward what had happened. And so that freedom is as much of a fact as all the other facts, and that has to be included. There are a few passages from recent things I've been reading that I wanted to just layer into this, to that characterization, which will also kind of float over what we'll be doing now. But one is from a novel of E.L. Doctorow's, who writes, this is from The Waterworks, and at a certain point, his narrator writes the following: I withhold here the circumstances of our first sight of Sartorius, who's going to be the villain of the piece. I want to keep to the chronology of things, but at the same time to make their pattern sensible, which means disrupting the chronology. After all, there's a difference between living in some kind of day-to-day crawl through chaos, where there's no hierarchy to your thoughts, but a raucous equality among them, and knowing in advance the whole conclusive order which makes narration suspect. All narration. A passage from Robert Harris, the writer of the excellent English writer of books like The Enigma and Pompeii and so forth, and he wrote a book called The Ghost, in which the main character is a ghostwriter for a Tony Blair-like former prime minister. And he at one point has his ghostwriter writing, "I had never witnessed any of my authors at a real crisis in their lives before, and scrutinizing Lang, the character, I gradually began to realize that my favorite catch-all question, how did it feel, was in truth a crude tool, vague to the point of uselessness. In the course of those few minutes, as the legal procedure was explained, a rapid succession of emotions swept across Lang's craggy face, as fleeting as cloud shadows passing over a hillside in spring. Shock, fury, hurt, defiance, dismay, shame. How are these to be disentangled? And if he didn't know precisely what he felt now, even as he was feeling it, how could he be expected to know it in 10 years' time? Even his reaction at this moment I would have had to manufacture for him. I'd have had to simplify it to make it plausible. I'd have had to draw on my own imagination. In a sense, I would have had to lie." And in a similar vein, this great passage from Philip Roth from The Human Stain. Human Stain is his wonderful novel about political correctness on campus, among other things. And at one point, his main character, Coleman, gets a kind of threatening letter from a fellow faculty member saying that everybody knows you're having an affair, basically. But it just goes, everybody knows. And the narrator writes, 3 rows down from me, Coleman, his head tipped slightly toward hers, was talking to Fawn quietly, seriously, but about what, of course, I did not know. By the way, the letter had said, everybody knows. That had been the entire letter. Because we don't know, do we? Excuse me. Because we don't know, do we? It's funny that I'm seizing on that. Because we don't know, do we? Everyone knows how what happens the way it does. What underlies the anarchy of the train of events, the uncertainties, the mishaps, the disunity, the shocking irregularities that define human affairs? Nobody knows. Everyone knows is the invocation of the cliche and the beginning of the banalization of experience. And it's the solemnity and the sense of authority that people have in voicing the cliche that makes it so insufferable. What we know is that, in an uncliched way, nobody knows anything. You can't know anything. The things you know, you don't know. Intention, motive, consequence, meaning. All that we don't know is astonishing. Even more astonishing is what passes for knowing. Anyway, I thought I would lay those out as a whiff over what we'll talk about today. And that is indeed Joseph Mitchell's Joe Gould's Secret. I warned you that I adore this book, and that, well, I don't want to completely prejudice the conversation. Let me start by asking, what did some of you feel about it? The book in general, and particular things in it that might have excited or bothered you. Come on. I'm going to stare you down. I'm not going to say a word until you say something.
It's amazing that it's true.
It's amazing that it's true.
And I was also reading, I guess, The Bottom of the Harbor.
The Bottom of the Harbor, another one of the books, yeah. Right.
I think you also wonder how he ever, got all of those long quotations of the
So on the one hand, it's amazing it's true. One wonders how he got all those long quotations. I'm reminded of a quote of Leo Rostand's, who, this was in response to, I said this to that Sartre quote from last week about how everything was inexplicable to us as it was happening. And Leo Rostand writes, truth is stranger than fiction. Fiction has to make some sense. But indeed, one of the things that's interesting about this is these incredibly long quotations and how he was able to do that. We'll talk about that in a second. But other thoughts about it? Yeah.
Astonishing to me how he put up with this guy and then he did. It looked like there's fascination he had in him. Like, what must have compelled him to come back every day doing this guy?
So I'm just repeating for them that it's astonishing he put up with him for that long, and the perversity of even hanging on, staying and going back forward. By the way, this is, in the story here, it has him having 3 conversations with him, but of course he in fact had dozens of conversations with him. And, yeah. The whole thing about the fact that he came back to it, in fact, there is in the book, as you know, Professor Siegel is the first version, which is in fact the version he talks about, the 1942 version, and then coming back years later and having this cache of memories and so forth. Yeah.
The aspect of it, the double profile aspect of it, really made it come alive. Because he has a lot of profiles where he gives these two long quotes to individual people, but the way you see Joe Gould affecting him, his
Right.
development, and especially knowing the kind of what happens to him as a writer afterwards.
Yeah. Hold that in abeyance. Not everybody knows it, but we will discuss that. But the double profile aspect is absolutely remarkable, and especially as we will see, talking about what happens later. Yeah.
Well, it's just a whole embodiment of the chaos and the, it's like, it just would be like one little clip, and you could see, like, you could see everyone, you can see the brilliance underneath it, and then the madness that finished it, that chaos.
Yeah. The Joe Gould himself being total chaos, and yet this jewel-like concentration briefly, and then it falls into chaos again. Yeah. Anyway, as I say to people, we're not doing literature today. We're doing theology, because I cannot understand how anybody could have written this book. But why don't we start at the beginning? Joe Gould was an odd and penniless and unemployable little man who came to the city in 1916 and ducked and dodged and held on as hard as he could for over 35 years. Already things are beginning to happen there. Ducked is going to show up later on as the duck farm. Holding on as long as you can is going to show up in the very last sentence of the book, as we'll see. He was a member of one of the oldest families in New England. The Goulds were the Goulds, he used to say, when the Cabots and the Lowells were clam diggers, a great line. Toward the end. I never felt at home, even in New York City, especially in Greenwich Village, down among the cranks and the misfits and the one-lungers and the has-beens and the might-have-beens and the would-be's and the never-wills and the God-knows-whats. I've always felt at home. And that's the first of the places where you begin to get this double life going on. All the way through this book, think of the fact that this is Joseph Mitchell typing these sentences. In those days they had typewriters, and but typing the word I, and it's the I shimmers back and forth between him and Gould. Gould looked like a bum and he lived like a bum, but he wasn't a bum. I mean, that's the subtext there. And he goes on with these wonderful descriptions, but one of the things that's very important is right at the very beginning, he's going to tell you that this is a complete, whatever else he is, he's a complete, total asshole. He is just a completely disgusting person. On occasion he stole. He usually stole books from booksellers and sold them to second-hand bookstores, but if he was sufficiently hard-pressed, he stole from friends. One terribly cold night, he knocked on the door of the studio of a sculptor who was almost as poor as he was, and the sculptor let him in, and let him spend the night rolled up like a mummy in layers of newspaper and sculpture shrouds on the floor of the studio, and the next morning he got up early and stole some of the sculptor's tools and he pawned them. Not a nice man. And parenthetically, that too is going to resonate later on in terms of what's happening in terms of what it is to hang out with this guy. He was nonsensical and bumptious and inquisitive and gossipy and mocking and sarcastic and scurrilous. Just, by the way, wonderful words. Not a single one I think you read in the last week anywhere else. Just great words. All through the years, nevertheless, a long succession of people believed that he was up to something great, because they believed that a book he had been working on for many years might possibly turn out to be a good book, even a great one. and they wanted to encourage him. And then he goes on to say, that it's the oral history. Some talk has an obvious meaning and nothing more, he said, and some, often unbeknownst to the talker, has at least one other meaning and sometimes several other meanings lurking around inside its obvious meaning. The latter kind of talk, he said, was what he was collecting for the oral history. And it's parenthetically what this entire book has in it. That's been Joseph Mitchell's entire career. In times to come, he said on another occasion, people may read the Gould's oral history to see what went wrong with us, the way we read Gibbon's Decline and Fall to see what went wrong with the Romans, and in fact, the way we read Joe Gould's Secret by Joseph Mitchell to see what went wrong with us. The book was already millions of words long, nowhere near finished. And so, one evening in June 1942, we're in the middle of page 626, I'll get to that in a second, but that he told a friend, June 1942 is when he's going to be doing this thing, and the friend he told is obviously Mitchell, that the book was approximately 9,255,000 words long, about a dozen times as long as the Bible. And then we get the same thing that I did, same thing I did, the thing I learned from him that I did in the Breitenbach piece, which is you get the entire story in the next paragraph. There's nothing in this piece is going to be a surprise. In 1952, he collapsed. He goes to Pilgrim's State. He dies there. Directly after the funeral, friends of his in the village began trying to find the manuscripts. This is all stuff. I mean, none of this is. You just said it all out, and then you have to tell it again a second time in a mode that throws everything you just said that seemed simple into question. But anyway, but without success. Everybody's looking for the things. Not a single one of the composition books was found, or has ever been found. An interesting verb tense there. And I would suggest to you, by the way, that at one level there's no surprise here. Already in the verb tenses here, you know what the secret's going to be, that it doesn't exist. That I don't think comes as a surprise to you. It's not meant to come as a surprise. What is going to come as a surprise is how incredibly brilliantly it's laid out. And even more and more brilliantly. That will be breathtaking, but the facts of the situation won't be a surprise. For indeed, you get this gorgeous sentence in the next paragraph on 627. I got so I could put two and two together and make at least a little sense out of what he was saying, even when he was very drunk or very exalted or in both states at once, and gradually, without intending to, I learned some things about him that he may not have wanted me to know, or on the other hand, since his mind was circuitous and he loved wheels within wheels, that he may very well have wanted me to know. I'll never be sure. In any case, I'm quite sure that I know why the manuscript of the oral history has never been found. And I decided to keep it a secret for a long time, and I was going to, but since then I've come to the conclusion that my resolution was pointless, and that I should tell what I know, and I'm going to do so. Beforehand, though, I want to tell you why I feel compelled to do so. And why was it that he feels compelled to do so? What has changed? He went to see Alice Neal, right? And so he goes to see Alice Neal, and they have this wonderful conversation. And Alice Neal, at one point, he talks about Alice Neal, by the way. He, at one point, had bragged that, Gould had bragged that Alice Neal was a great, great painter, and she'd done a great painting of him, and someday it would hang in the Whitney, and sure enough it has, hung in the Whitney. And indeed, right here, I have the catalog of the Whitney show of Alice Neal. And so he goes to talk to Alice Neal, and she's showing him the other paintings. At one point, there's that great painting where she says, another was a painting of a young Puerto Rican man sitting in a hospital bed and staring wide-eyed into the distance. TB, she said, died, but he didn't. He recovered and became a codeine addict, which is where Grace Paley gets conversation with my father from. I mean, this, by the way, this is just spreading seeds everywhere, that kind of attitude. Codeine, gonna die, but he didn't. He became a codeine addict instead. And he goes on, and eventually she shows the painting of Joe Gould. I assume you all went to the internet to look for the painting of Joe Gould? Come on, people. You have no excuse. It was in the old days. It was one thing when you had to go to the library, but now you can just go. Here, by the way, is a wonderful postcard of Alice Neal. I'll put that down here. You can look at that later. But here is her portrait of Joe Gould. which was a completely whacked out portrait. He looks like a superlatively endowed Leon Trotsky, I think, actually. But anyway, so let's, where were we? So at the conclusion, looking at that portrait, is she says to him, well, you know, he was an exhibitionist. There was a bit of an exhibitionist to him, and that's the thing that he keys in on. And I concluded that if it was possible for the real Joe Gould to have any feeling about the matter, one way or the other, he wouldn't be the least displeased if I told anything at all about him that I happen to know. Quite the contrary. And by the way, anything at all about him is going to turn out to be really loaded. That's saying something. But that picture reminds him that he is quite an exhibitionist. So okay, the next sentence on 630, when I first met him in 1932. Let's do a little, I just want to give you a few dates here. So we know that Gould arrives in New York in 1916. We'll find out in a few pages that in 1917 he gets the idea for the oral history. In 1929, Joseph Mitchell arrives at age 21. So J.M. is 21. And in 1932, we have the first encounter. And by the way, this is just around the same time that she is doing her portrait of him. Turns out, I think she does her portrait in 1933. 1933 is also, from internal evidence, the year that that Mitchell is writing his James Joyce novel. Was 1933. So it's 10 years later that he writes the profile in 1942. And in 1952 is when Joe Gould will collapse, and it will be 1957 that he dies in Pilgrim State, and it's going to be 1962 that that Mitchell decides to go back and look at this stuff. So that just gives you a sense of the sweep of time involved. So it's 1932, and so remember how he meets him? He's at the Greek diner, and this crazy guy tumbles in, and one of the detectives, there are two detectives, and one of them says to the other one, "Who in God's holy name is that?" Which has the same kind of quality as that in the remember in the Susan Sheehan piece, you know, where the hell have you been? You know, and for that matter in the Breitenbach piece, what are you doing here? Who in God's holy name is that? And Paradox says, I don't know what you'd call him. His name is Joe Gould, and he's supposed to be writing the longest book in the history of the world. He looked like a bum, and he talked like a bum, but he wasn't a bum. You don't know what you'd call him. And so, at that point, the initial response of Joseph Mitchell is on page 633. In my eyes, he was an ancient, enigmatic, spectral figure, a banished man. I never saw him without thinking of the ancient mariner, or of the wandering Jew, or of the flying Dutchman, or of the silent old man called Swamp Jackson, who lived alone in a shack on the edge of a swamp near the small farming town in the south that I come from, and wandered widely on foot on the back roads of the countryside at night. Or of one of those men I used to puzzle over when I read the Bible as a child, who for transgressions that seemed mysterious to me had been cast out. Again, we're very close to that business about the double self-portrait happening here. In any case, one morning in the summer of 1942, sitting in my office at the New Yorker, I thought of Gould. Can anybody have any thoughts about what was happening in the summer of 1942? Well, there's a war, but isn't it? It's like the darkest possible moment of the war. France fell a year earlier. December 1941 is Pearl Harbor, and it's the darkest moment. You've got the Soviet Union is going to declare war on Russia. Stalingrad's right around the corner. You've got the farthest advance of the Japanese. They've taken over everything. The Battle of Midway hasn't yet started. This is one of those classic moments, the New Yorker, by the way, where, I mean, everybody else is doing, frantic war reportage, and Joseph Mitchell decides to write a piece which at the end of the day is about what we're fighting for, actually. I mean, this is a profoundly, deeply powerful look at the America of the post-Depression and the Depression. It always blows my mind that this is what he chooses to sit down and write at this point, is this particular piece. Anyway, so it's 1942, and he decides maybe he'll do this, and he starts looking around, and he calls and makes some calls, and before he knows it, he comes back to the office, and the receptionist has had a visitation by Joe Gould. He had actually been at the receptionist had called him because Joe Gould had showed up, and he said, give him $2. When I got back to the office, I gave the receptionist her $2. He was a terribly dirty little man and terribly nosy, she said. And I was glad to get him out of here. What was he nosy about? I asked. Well, for one thing, she said, he wanted to know how much I make. Also, she continued, handing me a folded slip of paper, he gave me this note as he was leaving and told me not to read it until he got out of the elevator. You have beautiful shoulders, my dear, the note said, and I should like to kiss them. He also left a note for you, which was, on second thought, 9:30 is a little early for me. Let's make it 11. So, indeed, the next day they meet, and you get that great line, I greet you at the beginning of a great endeavor. And then having said that, he seemed to falter, lose confidence, and they sit down. He says, actually, I'm very hungry, and so he orders some food. He is, Joe Gould, in a different tradition, is what's known as a schnorrer. He's endlessly finding ways to get stuff out of people. I suppose you're puzzled about me, he said. If so, he continued, the feeling is mutual, for I'm puzzled about myself and have been since childhood. Again, that I thing going on, that Joseph Mitchell is typing this sentence about Joe Gould. But he starts telling the story about how he is a Gould. He should have been born in Boston, but I wasn't. And he goes on to tell the story about his distinguished birth and his complete failure to live up to such distinguished, noble predecessors because, as he puts it, he was left-handed in both hands. And he's kind of a half pint, a tadpole, a shrimp, a peanut, a runt. He's a terrible embarrassment. Somehow he manages to survive all that, except at some point he overhears somebody say, did you notice the Gould boy today? The math teacher said something I didn't catch, and then the principal said, the disgusting little bastard can't even keep in step with himself. The Gould boy and bastard. That brought my father into it, he says. In two senses, the Gould boy, my father, but also he's a bastard, so he's not even my father. You know, they're saying something about my father. And so he decides he's got to shape up and that he is going to be a surgeon. And he tells his father that, and his father says, that'll be the day. If you did become a surgeon and if you performed operations the way you do everything else, when you got through with the patient, you'd have his insides so balled up, you'd have his heart hanging upside down and his liver turned around backward and his intestines wound around his lungs and his bladder joined onto his windpipe, and you'd have him walking on his hands and breathing through his behind and making water out of his left ear. Which, by the way, is exactly the way my grandfather described the manuscript of the guy who, in that letter that he wrote about, everything was attached to the wrong place. Gould sighed, and a look of intense sadness passed over his face. I held that remark against my father for a long time, he says. But then he goes on, and I was walking along the street one night here in New York and happened to think of it, and it must have been the first time I ever thought of it objectively, for I suddenly burst out laughing. that moment's going to happen 2 or 3 times in this piece, where you go from extreme, pathetic, pathos-inducing sorrow to laughter. It happens all the time. At this moment, the waitress put the plate of fried eggs in front of him, and they talk some more about his education and so forth, and how he goes to Harvard but doesn't quite make it, and this whole story about his life. Excuse me. Then you get this amazing, again, this thing that keeps on happening in this piece, where you go from hilarity and that feeling of peskiness. How can he stand being around him all this time? And it's just, and then you get these sentences like, at the bottom of 643, that's one of the damnedest thing I ever found out about human emotions and how treacherous they can be. The fact that you can hate a place with all your heart and soul and still be homesick for it. Not to speak of the fact that you can hate a person with all your heart and soul and still long for that person. One of the things that we very interesting about this piece is you're not going to hear anything about his love life. There's this tremendous sense of intimacy in the piece, at the same time without a kind of betrayal of what are finally just personal details and so forth. But there's a whole raft of things caught up in that sentence. You can hate a person with all your heart and soul and still long for that person. Anyway, so here's where he says that he's now living, he arrives in 1916. In 1917, he was recovering from a hangover, and he recalled this line of William Butler Yeats: "The history of a nation is not in parliaments and battlefields, but in what the people say to each other on fair days and high days, and how they farm and quarrel and go on pilgrimage." And all at once, the idea of the oral history occurred to me. That's, of course, that could easily be Joseph Mitchell's slogan for the entire rest of everything you've been hearing in the book that's his collected works here. In any case, he basically, this is where he takes off, and then he says, "Since that fateful morning, the oral history has been my rope and my scaffold, my bed and my board, my wife and my floozy, my wound and the salt on it, my whiskey and my aspirin, my rock and my salvation is the only thing that matters. A damn to me, all else is dross." At which point, this great speech, almost Shakespearean speech, and Mitchell immediately undercuts it. It was obvious this was a set speech. And it made me a little bit uncomfortable. Just now when you told the waitress that you were authority on the language of the seagull, I changed the subject. Did you mean it? At which point his face lights up, and he starts describing how he's translated all kinds of American poems into seagull, and so forth. And so he's beginning to say that he's tired, and he says, "We can continue our talk some other time." "Of course," I said. "You won't mind." "Oh, no. Except I was hoping I could see some of the oral history and maybe even read some of it." Mr. Gould. And so he reaches into his pocket, and he starts, and by the way, this is all one conversation. This whole thing is one conversation. And what I think I've said that my warrant to you when you read my stuff is that everything that's said was more or less said, and every description, every place where I allege it was said, some kind of conversation did take place at that point. I am not warranting to you that what I say was said there, and I think you know that. And for that matter, it's clear in this piece that while there are just 3 conversations that are described, that there must have been many, many more. And what's strange is that this conversation includes stuff from all kinds of other conversations, but having said that, the main thing it brings out is how endless these conversations were. And I'm sure that's true, that the conversations just went on and on and on. In this case, he's gathered all the parts that have happened in all the different conversations about his upbringing, for example, but in point of fact, no doubt they happened in other places. But anyway, and so you think the conversation is over here, but it keeps on going, and so now he tells him about Ezra Pound and E. Cummings. Do any of you know E. Cummings' poem on Gould? If you have that purple book, the 100 Selected Poems of E. Cummings. Number 39. Little Joe Gould has lost his teeth and doesn't know where to find them, and found a second-hand set which click. Little Gould used to amputate his appetite with bad brittle candy, but just nude eel. Now little Joe lives on air. Harvard brevis est, for handkerchief read paper napkin. No laundry bills like people preferring Negroes, Indians, use, and be ye twag of little Joe Yankee Gould irketh sundry, who are trying to find their minds, but never had any to lose. And a myth is as good as a smile, but little Joe Gould's, quote, oral history, unquote, might, publishers take note, be entitled A Wraith's Progress, or Mainly Awash While Chiefly Submerged, or An Amoral Morality Sort of Aliving by Innumerable Kinds of Deaths. Amerique, je t'aime, and it may be fun to be fooled, but it's more fun to be little Joe Gould. By the way, and it may be fun to be fooled, says E. Cummings about Joe Gould already at that time. But anyway. So anyway, he's saying, and then you get this whole thing about all these different magazines that have published little sections of it, and then you get Marianne Moore wants to put it in the Dial, and that's going on for a while, and then he at a certain point, and we're still in the same conversation. In recent years, quite a few people have turned against me, he says. Probably the real reason is a certain poem I wrote. And then he takes, 3 pages before he finally gets the poem, which is this poem about the Bohemians or 4 pages before he finally gets to it. This prissy hedge in front of the Brevoort. The Brevoort is right around here, right? You know where the Brevoort is. It's down the street. The prissy hedge in front of the Brevoort is but a symbol of the coming revolution. These are the barricades, the barricades, the barricades, and behind these barricades, behind these barricades, behind these barricades, the comrades die. The comrades die, the comrades die, and beneath these barricades, the comrades die of overeating. On the other hand, he says it may not be that at all. The goddamn truth, the absolute hideous and disgusting, unspeakable goddamn truth of the matter is, I am lousy. I discovered this morning while I was sitting through one of those masses at St. Joseph's. He's completely covered with lice. This is no way to live, he said, and his voice sounded defeated, but it's the only way I can live and work on the oral history. That lice thing will be held in abeyance for a while. We'll come back to bite us later on. That's what lousy comes from, being lice-ridden. If you're feeling lousy, you are feeling lice-ridden. But it's lost that meaning, but that's what it comes from. Then you get this wonderful sentence of Mitchell's. I started to try to say something optimistic, but sensed that I ran the risk of being presumptuous. A man who has no lice on him is not in a very good position to minimize the disagreeableness of lice if he is talking to a man who is crawling with them. That again is, you find that in Sandy Fraser in that passage where they're making fun of the Jewish singles, and he says, put it back. This kind of evenness of the narrative voice. Anyway, but we're still in the same conversation, and he has one more poem to recite before he leaves about the Dial magazine. Who killed the Dial? Who killed the Dial? I say, Joe Gould, with my inimitable style, I killed the Dial. Which, in terms of what we're going to find out later on, is really, really a spooky thing for Joseph Mitchell to write. As he recited it, he watched my face. When he finished it, I laughed more than he had expected me to, I think, and I was struck by how much pleasure that gave him. His bloodshot little eyes glowed with pleasure, and then giggling, he hurried off. Finally, the end of that conversation. And there is a quality of just being exhausted when you get to the end of that. I mean, it's really weird, by the way. You read books all the time, and they have however many pages they have. You don't feel exhausted, but you just feel exhausted at the end of that particular conversation. So anyway, he goes home and he has a few of these notebooks, and they're all the same story again, the death of Dr. Storer Gould and so forth. The first thing I must deal with is the account of my father's death, for he died twice. And you get this business about, parenthetically, this is the famous influenza outbreak that everybody's afraid H1N1 is going to be a repeat of. He seems to die in that, but he doesn't, that he dies after all. But, so he dies the second time. And Joe Gould writes, in autobiography and biography, as in history, I have discovered there are occasions when the facts do not tell the truth. However, in this case, I'm going to deal only with what it was. I must admit my father's actual and factual death. And then it goes on to say that the text was full of digressions. There were digressions that led into other digressions, and there were digressions within digressions. And then he proceeds to do some of these pirouettes for you. And you get to that remarkable thing on page 658. Never mind, Daniel Boone. He had run a line through never mind and had written let alone just above it. Then he had run a line through let alone and had written not to speak of just above it. And then he had run a line through not to speak of, and then in the margin beside never mind, he had written stet. And by the way, those things, think about them literally in terms of Joe Gould. Never mind. Not to speak of. Let alone. I mean, those are all rather amazing things for a person in Joe Gould's position to write. Right? Yeah.
Thinking about the death of the father, you go back and read Professor Siegel. He reports in there the not actual, the one that he got first.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So there's all kinds of strange things happening already.
Yeah, did he know?
Yeah. Yeah. You're gonna a whole part of this is going to be Joseph Mitchell's mea culpa for having misled people, but also explaining for why he misled them and what he thought was true and what he didn't think was true and so forth at different points. But anyway, then he goes on with all that. Ending with, I would judge the sanest man to be him who most firmly realizes the tragic isolation of humanity and pursues his essential purposes calmly, he wrote. I suppose I feel about it in this way because I have delusions of grandeur. I believe myself to be Joe Gould. Again, that's Joseph Mitchell typing that sentence, and it's pretty powerful in terms of what's going to happen. So on Saturday night, June 13th, 1942, he goes to Goody's, and he says, and now we start another one of these long conversations. You know, I was kind of hoping I'd see other stuff, but then they talk about the Raven Poetry Circle. In winter, I'm a Buddhist. In summer, I'm a nudist. And at this point, you know, I wanted to see some of this other stuff, the conversational stuff. He says, well, the great bulk of the oral history is stored in a place that's quite inaccessible, which will turn out to be the duck and goose of the duck and chicken farm, as in Wild Goose Chase. But in any case, but I have a friend named Aaron Siskin who has some, and so he goes off to meet Aaron Siskin, and Aaron Siskin says at this point to Joseph Mitchell, you know, he writes on the same subjects over and over again, and I'm afraid I've lost interest in the death of his father, the death of his mother, the red tomato habit, and the Indians out of North Dakota and all that. He seems to be a perfectionist. He seems determined to keep on writing until he gets it right. He did this and that, then he tore the whole thing up and threw it in the wastebasket. Jesus Joe, who in holy God's name? Jesus Joe, you certainly improved that one. You improved it right out of existence. Anyways, but that ends up like that. And the next night I go to Goody's again, and Joe Gould says, you were disappointed. Oh no, I said, yes you were, I can tell. Well, to be honest, I was. I was kind of looking for the other talk chapters. No, naturally that wasn't that. There are two kinds of chapters. There's this and the other. I suppose if we've gone this far, I have to tell you something, that almost everything has been stored in the duck and chicken farm on Long Island, and there's no way to get to it. And that obviously has the feel of Wild Goose Chase, a duck and chicken farm. That's where it is, and so then there's these episodes of trying to figure out how we could get it, and I tried. I had to call her during the day. She scolded me severely, This put me in a predicament, and because I couldn't very well do the story if I couldn't see this stuff. Gould was called a writer who had written a book taller than himself, as in Tall Tale. And then by 669, I guess, I'm sorry, Mr. Gould, I said, but I think we just better drop the whole thing. Gould's kind of terrified of this, and they sit down, and Gould now proceeds to recite for him from memory some of the talk things. And now we get these incredible long arias of the doleful old Hungarian woman known as Old Budapest or Old Buda the Pest. This part of the oral history is pretty gory, he said. It's called Echoes from the Backstairs of Bellevue, and it's divided into sections under such headings as spectacular operations and amputations, horrible deaths, sadistic doctors, alcoholic doctors, drug-addicted doctors, women-chasing doctors, huge tumors, etc., and strange things found during autopsies. And there's another section called An Infinitude of Bourgeois. Please excuse me for a minute. I've been so busy taking notes that I had to look up for some time, and now I looked up and saw that Gould was drunk, or close to it. And I said to him, you must be tired. I'm not tired. I'm not the least bit tired, he said. I closed my notebook and started to put it in my pocket. You're the one who's tired, he said. Don't go yet. There's a whole Scheherazade quality to this, of course, which is always the case with when you're out as a reporter talking to someone who you are. What are the other views of Scheherazade at any given moment? Either you're the Scheherazade reporter trying to keep the interview going, or they're the Scheherazade trying to keep you there. But don't go yet. I didn't say much about my mother the other day, and I feel I should. Don't bother taking notes, just listen. Isn't that a wonderful kind of barometric shift that happens there, where you feel the reporter put the notepad away, and this is going to be something that's more important than anything you've heard so far. And he starts to try and tell a story about his mother. And by the way, watch the game of emotions that happens in the next 2 pages. The thing about his mother, she never treated him as a grown-up. My mother did one thing to me when I was a boy that I've never been able to forgive or forget. And it's when one evening after supper I was studying, and I happened to look up and I saw that she was looking at me and apparently had been for some time, and that tears were running down her cheeks. My poor son, she said. Gould's eyes blazed. He was silent for a moment. His mother said, my poor son, which he could never get over. And this is all he's ever going to say about his mother in this piece. Suddenly he is already talking about his father. Can't deal with his mother. And he goes from talking about his mother's tears to the happiest day of his life, which is we got up before day and breakfast together, and they go and there was a crowd of railroadmen standing around the locomotive looking it over, and my father knew one of them. And how do you do, Mr. DeLaney? My father said, this is my son, Joseph. In front of them. I mean, all this business about his parents, the Gould boy, this is my son, this isn't my son, I feel sorry. And so he's incredibly happy at this memory. And we know he's happy because his eyes are filled with tears in the next sentence. So you go from his mother, whose eyes were filled with tears, making him feel horrible, to him telling the story about his father, for the happiest day of his life. This is my son, Joseph. His eyes were filled with tears. And then you get the drunk who comes along and says, oh, I know you've heard about it. Isn't it terrible about Bob, about Bob having died? And so you take this very moment of great emotion, and Gould immediately undercuts it. He died. That's fantastic. Great news that he died. I mean, the kind of roller coaster of what you laugh at, what you don't laugh at, what's sad. He was visibly delighted by this news. And he goes on, and they say good night. And then the next night, and this again continues, there followed a pattern. Gould would quote from the oral history while the gin and the beer were gradually taking hold, and then he would lose interest in the oral history and talk more about himself. One time he asked me if I was tired of listening to him, and I started to be polite and say, oh no, but word just made me frank, and then I said I was. Whereupon he snickered and said that he could sympathize with me, but that he had been waiting for years to talk to someone about himself. And since you're going to write about me, he said, you can't help yourself. It's your duty to listen to me. It's part of your job. Anyway, on the following Monday, June 19th, I started writing the profile of Gould. And he writes it, and he goes on vacation. Soon after I returned, early in August, Gould telephoned. By that time, the profile had been put in proof, and I asked him to come over and read it. And he does. And 2 days later, he has some more suggestions to make. He got in the habit of coming in at least once a week and trying to talk me into adding a few sentences here or a paragraph there. He never tried to get me to change anything. He just wanted me to put in more. On the majority of the days that he didn't come in, he telephoned me. The sound of his voice began to make me wince, which is the end of Act 1. Why don't we take a short break, and we'll start with Act 2, which is the Holy of Holies. Okay, so now we enter Act 2. On page 676, the profile appears in December 1942 as Professor Seagull. He begins getting letters. Joe Gould instantaneously begins to take on airs. I'm not just that nut Joe Gould, but that nut Joe Gould who may wind up being considered one of the greatest historians of all time, he says. And then this one guy who'd been one of the Brevoort people says that, I didn't realize what you intended. What makes you think you know what I don't intend? So at one point, he has a new hangout at the Banana Tavern. And there's all these letters. There's letters from people who had been in his class in Norwood High School. There's all sorts of letters. And Joseph Mitchell goes down to deliver the letters. And at that point, picks up one of the composition notebooks. And this is the first of what I refer to as these Twilight Zone moments, where you could hear the theme for the Twilight Zone, da 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 da, because indeed it's the death of Clark Gould. Again, this is kind of making sense of the fact that he had published Professor Seagull in a kind of believing voice, and now he's hey gang, quiet. Anyway, so you have this kind of strange moment that happens there where he picks it up, and that's a cause of great misgiving. And then he says, well, I tried to work on quality. So it's quality, I told him, not quality, not quantity. I told him that it was a little bit odd for somebody who was working on the biggest book of all time to be worried about quality, not quantity, and so forth. And then he goes back, and there's more mail. Oh, God, I remember thinking, I'm in for it now. And they almost have a fight. The next morning, Gould became conciliatory. In other words, he said, giggling, if you lie down with dogs, you have to expect to wake up with fleas, which is, of course, a throwback to that I am lousy, and whether or not you can have pity for somebody, be presumptuous if you have pity for them, and whether or not we can be presumptuous as readers having pity for Joseph Mitchell at this point. But in any case, it goes on. And now we get to, I want to talk about the structure of how this is structured, because this is a piece that has a double fulcrum and a climax. This is really unusual. Someday I'm going to do a series of diagrams of different kinds of plotting devices and so forth. And this is a really unusual one, because this one, so it's Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and this has, let me redo it this way. This has a climax here, but it has two fulcrums on its way to on the way to and the way back. You hardly ever see this, and it's very beautiful how it works out, because what happens at the top of he's getting frustrated and so forth at the bottom of 681. And I would sit and listen to him and try my best to show some interest in what he was saying, and gradually my eyes would glaze over, my blood would turn to water, and a kind of paralysis would set in. I was young then, and much more courteous to older people, and to everyone else for that matter, as I look back on it, than I should have been. Also, I had not yet found out about time. I was still under the illusion that I had plenty of time. Time for this, time for that, time for everything, time to waste. That's the first fulcrum. And the piece is going to totter now on the edge of that for the next 10 pages. I'd probably come to know more about him than anybody else in the city, and perhaps than anybody in the world. I do this, I do that, I do all this kind of, all the stuff you do. I knew that I was aware of, you know, he knew all the different connotations, and I just had to figure out some way to get rid of it. And this becomes the occasion for what's going to now be the motor of the engine. He decides to find him an editor. The best way to do this, I decided, was to get an editor or a publisher interested in the oral history. This is an echo of where he decides to go see Alice Neal. At each point he goes to, and that gets the thing moving. And so he tries, and he finds all these different editors, and eventually everybody he calls is in a rage because Gould doesn't show up. Gould obfuscates one way or another. He tries for Charles A. Pierce of Newell, Sloan, and Pierce. And then they get this amazing conversation where Pierce says, well, let me see some of it. Why do you want to see some of it? Well, you have to see all of it or none of it, you know, and nobody wants to read all of it. And unless you let me read it, and you really don't seem to want me to, how can I tell if it's feasible to publish it in its entirety, says Pierce. And Pierce leaves, and at this point, Mitchell is in a rage. And now we're coming to the climax here. Why the hell did you do that? And go to all the trouble if you've always been resolved in the back of your mind that it would be published posthumously. I'm beginning to believe, I went on, that the oral history doesn't exist. This remark came from my unconscious, and I was barely aware of the meaning of what I was saying. I was simply getting rid of my anger, but the next moment, glancing at Gould's face, I knew as well as I know anything that I had blundered upon the truth about the oral history. My God, I said, it doesn't exist. I was appalled. There isn't any such thing as oral history. I said, it doesn't exist. So now we are entering the sanctuary, the altar inside the Holy of Holies is the next 3 or 4 pages. It exists in your mind, I said, recovering a little from my surprise, but you've always been too lazy to write it down. He goes on. Gould turned and faced me and said something, but his voice was low and indistinct. If I heard him right, and I've often wondered if I did hear him right, he said, it's not a question of laziness. Then, evidently deciding not to say any more, he turned his back on me again. And he says, can you wait a second? And he says, no, I don't think I... By the way, what's the reason he has to wait? Because at this moment, Mitchell has to deal with proofs. He has another piece going through and he has to deal with proofs. But no, I don't think I'm going to wait while you deal with your proofs. I returned to my office, and with time to think things over, time being a very important word here, I began to feel ashamed. And now watch the word feel and felt in the next 2 or 3 pages, this litany. That thing he was talking about, that Harris was talking about how can you keep track of all the different emotions, let alone describe any given emotion at any given moment. So here, the first thing, I felt ashamed of myself for the way I had lost my temper. My anger began to die down, and I began to feel depressed. I'd been duped by him and so forth. He must have found out long ago that he didn't have the genius or the talent, or maybe the self-confidence or the industry or the determination to bring off a work as huge and as grand as he'd envisioned. And so he'd fallen back on writing those things and so forth. This reminds me, there's a beautiful passage in Lillian Hellman's Pentimento. Lillian Hellman is a deeply unreliable autobiographer, but having said that, she writes beautifully about a life she probably didn't live. And in this case, she's talking about a man, a millionaire, who she says had a crush on her. But this time the next day, in fact, I called him. I had not slept much that night, waking up to read and to think about Arthur. I was what he wanted to want, did not want, could not ever want, and that must have put an end to an old dream about the kind of life that he would never have because he didn't really want it. We've all done that about somebody or place or work, and it's a sad day when you find out that it's not accident or time or fortune, but just yourself that keeps things from you. Similarly, another passage from Robert Harris in that same book, The Ghost. I was more irritated than anything else. It certainly didn't strike me as sinister. Everybody tends to heighten his own reality. We start with a private fantasy about our lives, and perhaps one day, for fun, we turn it into an anecdote. No harm is done. Over the years, the anecdote is repeated so regularly that it becomes accepted as a fact. Quite soon, to contradict this fact would be embarrassing. In time, we probably come to believe that it was true all along, and by these slow accretions of myth, like a coral reef, the historical record takes shape. But anyway, coming back to this, the oral part of it might not exactly be down on paper, but he had it all in his head, and any day now he was going to start getting it down. It was easy for me to see how this could be, and now we come to the jewel inside the altar, inside the Holy of Holies, this next section. For it reminded me of a novel that I had once intended to write. I was 24 years old at the time he arrived at the age of, he's 21 years old when he arrives in 1929, so he's 24, so it's 1933, so it's just the year after he met Joe Gould. And I'd come under the spell of Joyce's Ulysses. My novel was to be about New York City. It was also to be about a day and a night in the life of a young reporter in New York City. He's a Southerner, and it goes on, and he starts describing this incredible Joycean novel, this amazing thing, and all this vividness of a Southerner in New York City, a young Southerner, and walking down the street and coming upon the preacher, the crazy preacher, and you know, the great horror of Babylon, the burning bush, the Baptist preachers, and so forth. But the reporter was held fast by the old man's rhetoric. He's writing in 1924, anticipating what will happen to him over the next period with Joe Gould. The more hideous the description, the wilder the sermon, the better the evangelist was considered to be. But nevertheless, they had left him with these things that he'd seen in the South. They left him with a lasting liking for the cryptic and the ambiguous, the incantatory and the disconnected, the extravagant and the oracular and the apocalyptic. Similar to that sentence before about the scurrilous, the da-da-da-da-da. He has these wonderful, very precise words one after another. And then he eventually comes upon this one guy in particular, and as the young reporter listens, it dawns on him that it's not the South that he longs for, but the past, the South's past and his own past, neither of which, in the way that he has been driven by homesickness to think of them, ever really existed, and that it is time for him to move out of the time gone by and into the here and now. It is time for him to grow up. This is the second of the fulcrums. So you have the two fulcrums. That it was I didn't understand time, I didn't have time to waste, and so forth. And then here, these two. I thought about that novel for over a year, says Joseph Mitchell. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to feel sympathetic to Gould. And then he goes on. In fact, he begins to feel that it was admirable that he hadn't done it. There's all these books, these torrents of books. One less book to clutter up the world. One less, you know, when I thought of the cataracts of books, the Niagara of books, the rushing rivers of books, only a very few which would be worth picking up and looking at, let alone reading, I began to feel that it was admirable that he had written it. One less book to clutter up the world. I suddenly felt a surge of genuine respect. There's a pun on the word felt all through here, which is like, this is a felt like a jeweler's, and he's going to show you all these different jewels, these different feelings laid out on this felt, this black felt. I felt a surge of genuine respect. He'd found a mask for himself, and he'd put it on, and he'd kept it on, referring back to that first sentence in the book, remember? He was an old, what's the first sentence? Joe Gould was who came, and he ducked and he dodged, and he held on as hard as he could. He'd put it on, and he'd kept it on. The eccentric author, the great mysterious unpublished book. And I was still adding to the list of all the things I was feeling when she walks in, the receptionist. Mr. Gould has come back, she said. So he walks in. You said you had some questions for me you wanted to ask. I did have, I said, but I don't now. There were some things I thought I wanted to know, but I guess I really don't. Let's just forget it. A look of relief appeared on Gould's face. But then he had this expression that he very much wanted to confide in me. And once again, my attitude toward him changed. I became disgusted with him. I felt like saying to him, don't lose your nerve now and start confessing and confiding. You know, but he goes on and, please forgive me, but you really must excuse me now. It's getting late and I have some things I have to do. This gave him the right to be huffy. Oh, he said, I'm ready to go. I've been ready to go for what seems like hours, but you held me up. After all, I've got things to do myself. He picked up his portfolio and walked out without saying goodbye, which is the end of Act 2. Just go back and read that again tonight. It's just an amazing piece of writing. And one of the most audacious things in this book is that now we have a whole other act. I mean, he has put the climax of this book, you know, at the very center of it, and yet we're going to now go on. And it's not going to be boring, but it's just going to be the way life is. That life does go on. Every character, real or imagined, deserves the open destiny of life. That things go on after the climactic moment. And so it goes on, and it's all very interesting and very fun. How he gets this grant, and then he begins to go crazy trying to figure out who it was who gave him the grant. And he's living in this very nice place, but he doesn't get much pleasure because he can't figure out who the woman is. And by the way, it's really powerful that it's a woman. Given somebody who can't talk about his mother, he's really obsessed with who this person is. And at one point, there's the various things. He's living the life of the millionaire. He can be incredibly horrible again. Remember the guy who asks him to submit his piece of writing to the millionaire lady? And he says, she hates it. She thought you were horrible. He's just like a total asshole. And then at one point, Madam X is thinking of stopping the subsidy, and he feels he better go and talk to Joe Gould, and goes upstairs, and we get the second Twilight Zone moment where he goes upstairs on page 707, and he starts looking at the pages that are written there, and it's exactly the same stuff. I put the books back the way they were and left the room. God pity him, I said, and pity us all. So his subsidy runs out. And from there, almost every step he took was a step going down. In the summer of '52, he's hysterical and eventually gets taken to Pilgrim State Hospital, which, by the way, do you catch the name of that place? Pilgrim State, for the last of the Goulds. The Goulds, the Stores, the Clarks, ends up at Pilgrim State Hospital. We have a friend of yours here at Pilgrim State, and his friend Gottlieb starts calling him on 7/14. Joe's worst symptom is apathy, he said during one of those calls. He mostly just sits and stares in the distance. However, every once in a while, the doctors say, something seems to stir in his mind and a smile comes on his face, and he rouses himself and he gets up and scampers around the ward and waves his arms up and down and makes strange earthy screeches until he wears himself out. He seems to be trying to communicate something with those screeches. The doctors and the nurses and the other patients don't know what he's doing, of course. They're completely mystified, but I know what he's doing, and I'm sure you do too. And then on Sunday, August 18th, 1957, Mitchell gets a call from Gottlieb that he's died. By the way, Gottlieb says, where's the oral history? I said, I didn't know. Gottlieb's voice instantaneously becomes concerned. We've got to set up a committee. We've got to start looking for it. You will help us with this, won't you? You will be on the committee. 7:15. I didn't know what to say to Gottlieb. Gottlieb was an energetic man, the kind of man who gets things done, and so forth. I could save him and his committee quite a wild goose chase, referring back to the duck farm. But one of the few things I've learned going through life is that there is a time and a place for everything. Again, that echo of the folk, the ecclesiastical echo, Ecclesiastes, that happened in both of the fulcrums. There's a time and a place for everything. And this was not, but I didn't think that this was the time or the place to be telling one of Joe Gould's oldest friends that I didn't believe the oral history existed. Joe Gould wasn't even in his grave yet. He wasn't even cold yet. And this was no time to be telling his secret. You could keep. Let them go ahead and look for the oral history, I thought. After all, I thought, I could be wrong. Hell, I thought. And the thought made me smile. Maybe they'll find it. Gottlieb repeated the question, this time a little impatiently. "You will be on the committee, won't you?" he asked. "Yes," I said, continuing to play the role I had stepped into the afternoon I discovered the oral history did not exist, a role that I was now stepping out of. Remember, he held on until the end. It was first sentence. A role that I'm now stepping out of. Yes, of course I will. What is he rhyming on there? What's the riff there at the very end? Oh, that awful deep down torrent. Oh, and the sea, crimson sometimes like a fire, and the glorious sunsets and the fig trees in the Alameda Gardens. Yes. And all the queer little streets and pink and blue and yellow houses and the rose gardens and the jessamine and the geraniums and the cactuses and Gibraltar as a girl where I was a flower of the mountain. Yes. When I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red? Yes. How he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I yes, to say yes, yes, my mountain flower. At first I put my hands around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts and all perfume, yes. His heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. This is extremely consciously on the part of Joseph Mitchell, an echo of the ending of Ulysses. Yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Of course I will. It occurs to me that it is also, and this I only realized the other day, an echo of the end of Heart of Darkness. Remember how Heart of Darkness ends? Remember, Marlowe has been to see Kurtz, and Kurtz's last words are the horror, this horrible monster, and he comes back to talk to Kurtz's fiancée. And Kurtz's fiancée has this totally idealized view of this man who's become a complete monster. It is exactly the same situation. But I believed in him more than anyone on earth. More than his own mother, more than himself. He needed me. I would have treasured every sigh, every word, every sigh, every glance. I felt like a chill grip on my chest. Don't, I said in a muffled voice. Forgive me, I've mourned so long in silence. You were with him to the last. I think of his loneliness, nobody near to understand him, as I would have understood. Perhaps no one to hear. To the very end, I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright. Repeat them, she murmured in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with. You were what his last words actually were. The horror, right? I was on the point of crying out to her, don't you hear them? The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first whisper of a rising wind. The horror. His last word, to live with, she insisted. Don't you understand? I loved him. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was, your name. That's the same kind of situation happening there at the end of Bilbo's Secret. And of course leads us to, in fact, what is the Heart of Darkness, which now I invite you to tell us. What is the Heart of Darkness about this piece? The fact that this is the last thing he ever writes. This is the greatest writer of nonfiction in America, universally acknowledged as such at that time in 1964. He writes this piece and never publishes another word. It must have been very strange to be William Shawn in 1964 to have in your stable, the editor of the New Yorker, he had in his stable the greatest writer of nonfiction, the greatest writer of fiction in the country, and both of them go dead silent simultaneously. So the question in the case of Salinger, if you read his last thing before he goes silent, it's kind of good riddance. I mean, he was going completely nuts at the end there. But here you have a man writing what is arguably the greatest piece of writing. A lot of people feel it is. And then from this suddenly goes silent. He would be at the New Yorker until 1992, I think. and he was getting a monthly stipend for work on the piece that he was still working on. Well, so what do you think is happening there? I mean, this is the great question. This is one of the mysteries of 20th century American literary history. What happened to Joseph Mitchell? I mean, there are different theories. One of them is that one way of thinking about Joe Gould's, the story of Joe Gould is it's a chronicle of the worst case of writer's block ever recorded. And it turns out to be contagious. Contagious in a way that he even seems to know as he's writing it. Who killed the dial? Who killed the dial? I killed the dial. Another theory is, what else happened in 1964? And this applies both to Salinger, but especially to Joseph Mitchell. Well, there's that, but I would think it's the Beatles. I mean, the world in which Joseph Mitchell makes sense ceases to exist suddenly and completely between the Kennedy assassination and the rise of the Beatles. It's just it's a completely different world. It's a world where you would spend time with a bum, suddenly becoming a world where all you spend time with were people under 30. Anybody over 30 wasn't worth listening to. You know, I mean, the youth culture is coming in with a huge thing. Another theory, it seems to me, is that this was indeed Ulysses. That he had done Ulysses, and what he was trying to do was Finnegan's Wake, and it was just too hard. I don't think it was a question of laziness, if I understood correctly. The fact of the matter is that he was there most every day at the office, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man, and the New Yorker got every cent worth having him there, because a whole new generation of writers, myself least, but Ian Fraser, Mark Singer, Janet Malcolm, Jamaica Kincaid, all had him there. Robert Boynton here at NYU has published a book called the Doodoo Journalism, which is a set of interviews with writers. I'm one of them, but what's fascinating is it comes off of Tom Wolfe's book, The New Journalism, published in 64, 65, 66, during that period. That's when Tom Wolfe was coming online. And Tom Wolfe has total disdain for the zombies at the New Yorker, and specifically for Joseph Mitchell. And what's fascinating is that the next generation, that Tom Wolfe has no progeny. Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson really finally don't have important people. They were spectacular. I mean, not in any way downplayed how amazing they were at their moment, but they were so of their moment that they just exploded and fizzled out. And then if you talk to writers of my generation, which is the next generation, all of us go back to Joseph Mitchell, or to Lee Blig, Jenna Flatter, a few other people, and in fact, his physical presence at the office was just so amazing. He would go and talk to me, take you out to lunch. He was a fantastic listener. You imagine that he could easily take the whole lunch and turn it into one of those long, long quotes. And you would hear the typewriter going back there. Is it that he was a perfectionist? I mean, he perfected it right out of existence. Was it because he just couldn't let out something that wasn't quite right, and that now his standards were so much higher even than they had been? I mean, I like to think that what he's writing there is the book that he describes. That he's tried to write that. Pardon?
What happened when you got there?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, a few other stories. One of the things that was very interesting about him is that he allowed all the work to go out of print. Not only allowed, but wouldn't allow it to be reprinted. And so for that period when Ian Fraser and Mark Singer and I and Jamaica Kincaid and Tony Hiss and Janet Malcolm and everybody else was arriving, the books weren't available. And what happened with all of us with our first paycheck from the New Yorker was we had to spend $2,000 of our first paycheck to buy the shelf of Joseph Mitchell books. It was only when we got paid by the New Yorker that we could afford to buy them because they were all incredibly expensive. And we would all sit there, will you please, this is ridiculous, will you please let this stuff be republished and so forth? And he said, oh, nobody would care, nobody would. And finally it was, within his lifetime, republished by Dan Frank, by the way, at Pantheon. And it was wonderfully received, and I think that was some satisfaction to him. An interesting thing about the book, by the way, very strange, is it's dedicated to Sheila McGrath. The bound galleys are dedicated to his former wife, who had died, who was a wonderful photographer. And sometime between the galleys and this, Sheila implored him to dedicate it to her, which he did. Sheila was the business manager at the New Yorker, a very, very funny Scotswoman who, my favorite story of Sheila's, I went out to lunch with her, and we were walking up from the New Yorker's offices up 47th, and the Lubovichers were out, you know, the Lubovichers and their mitzvah tanks, and the two of us were walking side by side, and one of these guys came up to us and said, excuse me, are you Jewish? And she just shot back and said, are you kidding? I have enough sources being a chiksa, she said. So she was very funny, but quite possessive of him, I think. And there is a rumor, or there is for a long time been a rumor, that she has the disc of the last book of Joseph Mitchell. And it's all on in those days it was a floppy disk. She certainly has gone to lunch on that rumor with all the publishers in town. So maybe there is, maybe it will turn up. But oh, people ask all the time, and she's very mysterious about it. He was working on his project. He was working on it. Did he carry signs of distress? No, he was kind of serene, I think. He certainly was serene when he would take. He was very much interested in all of us, very supportive.
So he didn't talk about having read the book.
No, I mean, we didn't ask him in so many words, but it was spooky, and you would hear the typewriter every once in a while. And I once went there. There were all these little note cards on a table on his desk.
But your book, like, obviously was, insane. So you understood why he had
Well, if you're a writer, you understand why anybody has writer's block.
Well, I mean, I understand.
Yeah.
You
You empathize.
I empathize, but I'm just curious because it's so terrifying. Was there like
Yeah, was there sides? I don't think there was. Now again, keep in mind, I was meeting him when he was in his 70s and 80s, and somewhat we had a right to be retired at that point. But no, he was a man of tremendous decorum. He was a Southern gentleman. Ooh, he had this wonderful way. Ooh, isn't that true? Ooh, he would breathe in like that. It was really great. But no, writer's block. I was thinking actually I would talk a little bit about writer's block because that is, we haven't talked about that, and that is, it seems to be an essential part of writing. Thomas Mann at some point says that writers are people for whom it's more difficult to write than it is for other people. Thomas Mann says that. Writers are people for whom it is more difficult to write than it is for other people. I know in my own case, just talking about, for instance, about the Breitenbach piece, which I was talking to you about last week, and I brought, because we didn't really have time to talk about it, the index. I happen right now, this very minute, to be in a horrendous blockage on a project I need to be doing, and I can report to you what it's like, although I've memorized this because I know this is what it's always like. But in my case, what happens often is that I do all the reporting, and then I index the notes. And the indexes can be insanely long. They're all done in handwriting. And for the people who looked at the Breitenbach piece last week, if you want, you can come up here and take a look. But this is the index to the notes for what became the Breitenbach. This is not the notes. This is the index to the notes, which is insane. And always, not done on computers, done in handwriting. And by the time I finish indexing my notes, and the way I index them is I just take notebook number 1, page number 1, and I put down where it might, any category it might come up under, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and so forth. And then I finish that. And at that point, I am bored out of my mind with the subject. I have what I call double South Pole magnetism. My eyes are magnetized south, and the blank page or the computer screen is magnetized south, and everything else in the universe is magnetized north. God, how do blackboards work? Just anything. Just everything's fascinating to me, except and I just literally cannot bring my eyes onto the empty page out of boredom that is life-threatening. I mean, it is just so complete. And during that time in my own life, I often play with blocks. I have large collections of blocks. My daughter, growing up, knew that those were Daddy's blocks. She was not to play with Daddy's blocks. And what I'm doing, I mean, I'm literally not thinking about it. I'm just playing, and what I'm thinking about, if anything, is structure. But I'm talking about months and months go by, and my daughter goes to school and comes back and sees cathedrals that I've built. And she, oh, you've had a good day today, she says. And it's completely stupid. You cannot believe how stupid it is and how stupefying it is. I think one of the differences between people who are writers and people who stop being writers are people who learn how to deal with that. That a key part of it is self-loathing. You almost have to, it's almost like a boil. You have to get the boiling fumes of self-loathing, and then they kind of alchemically rise to the top of the skull, and they kind of drip down in condensation, and that will become the stuff that will be the good stuff at the end. But so you can't fool yourself. You can't not hate yourself. You have to hate yourself. But you can't hate yourself to the point where you just commit suicide or you stop. You have to know that it's part of the process. But anyway, what happens with me is that I will, at a certain point, while I'm playing with my blocks, I'll say, well, that's interesting. How about if I, instead of doing this, did this? And it's purely formal issues that become, I start thinking, well, with the Breitenbach piece, why did I put the mirror, that quote about the mirror, why did I put that right in the middle? Yeah, and then that could rhyme with that thing over here about the other thing about that's interesting. As I keep playing with my blocks. And at a certain point, I begin to get really, really fascinated by formal issues. I will never be interested in the subject again. But I will get interested, and I will become passionately interested. I'll become obsessed with purely formal issues. And at that point, it flips polarities. My eyes become north, the paper becomes south. The buildings can be burning down. I don't care. I just want to stay focused on it. And what's really, really fun, and this is the thing that's so exciting, is that time and again you find out things about the world itself, about Breitenbach, about Bosnia, about whatever, out of those formal kind of connections you make. Because truth is beauty and beauty is truth. It's really amazing. There are things that I hadn't realized about Breitenbach that I came to understand just from formal connections. I have come to learn, but I just can't. I might as well just live with it. And it's terrifying. I have a piece that is due a week from Wednesday, and it is due a week from Wednesday, and people will die and continents will collapse if I don't have it a week from Wednesday, and I cannot do it. I cannot do it. I am just bored out of my mind. I cannot look at it. And as I stand before you tonight, I am terrified I'm going to blow it, and it will be known once and for all as the failure that I truly am. But at another level, I kind of know that I will do it. I don't know how. It's like that great scene in Shakespeare in Love, how's it going? It's a mystery. How are we ever going to get this in? Don't worry, it'll happen. It's a mystery.
Do you have that kind of faith? Do you believe that that's
I can't imagine how, but I know that time and again I have.
Yeah, have you ever, I mean, it makes me think of, I read a profile on stage, right?
Uh-huh.
And the actor like actually got in the car and then drove away 2 weeks,
Right.
Yeah.
Stephen Fry's stage fright we're talking about, yeah, and how it could happen to an actor, yeah.
But, so did, no, I forgot what I did.
Have I ever,
Have you ever?
have I ever failed completely? I think I probably have occasionally. And then the piece just doesn't get written. Which, by the way, comedy, not tragedy. I mean, nobody dies. And then in fact, it's always there to be picked up. And what a book I intend to write, if I ever get any time, is going to be called The Ones That Got Away. It'll be a memoir in the form of all the pieces I meant to write, that for one reason or another I never got around to writing. Like that, but this will be a kind of one fantastic pitch after another in the subjunctive mode. Wouldn't this have been a great book? Wouldn't this have been a great book? Years ago, I wanted to write about and this is a piece you can't write anymore, but I wanted to write a piece about kindergarten humor. And I went back to my kindergarten, Bay Street School in Van Nuys, California, and I just hung out for a few days with the kids. This is a reporting you could not do nowadays, but and I just got them to tell me the jokes, and they were exactly the same jokes that had been in that playground when I was there. And I had this son, and exactly the kids were exactly as clueless as I had been. They were all sex jokes, so the kids didn't understand, but they thought it was hilarious, you know. Mommy, says the little girl, you know, I made $1 today. How'd you make $1? The boys were betting me that I couldn't climb the maypole, you know. Oh, silly, they just, but I did. Oh, silly, they just wanted to see your underpants. Well, I fooled them, I wasn't wearing any. Ha, 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 ha. Kids would crack up laughing at this. And jokes like that. And I became convinced that the jokes at LeMay Street School were the only really living thing on this planet. That humanity is just this river that goes through, and the jokes are the things that are alive and stay alive. And I wanted to write that. I have a whole bunch of other things like that I wanted to do, but anyway.
It seems like in a sense that's what Mitchell was doing, is that I think he might have thought this was the only way I can write my unfinished novel. But it
Right. Well, this was the way, but so one possibility that this is how he writes his unfinished novel. In the same way, in the same voice as I was just describing mine, so that explains the power of Joe Gould's secret, or phrased differently, he put his unfinished novel in a space capsule and used that Joe Gould story launches his novel, then we have the 2001 moment with the monolith of the novel floating in space. One can imagine that, but then what about what happened afterwards?
So how many years was he at the New Yorker?
He wrote this in 1964. He started at the New Yorker in the late 30s, I think, and he wrote this in 1964, and he died, I think, in 1992 or 93. But he was from 64 to 92, he was there.
That's a tribute to Tom, too, right?
Oh, of course it is.
But then what about when Sean left?
Oddly enough, Gottlieb kept him going, and then Tina had the good sense. Tina scoped out the situation, realized that he was a local god, and she kept it up too. And there are, I mean, as I think I told you, there are 20 writers who would tell you that this is the greatest piece of writing they've read, and including, oddly enough, Janet Malcolm is one of the biggest fans, and this is so unlike Janet Malcolm. Janet Malcolm, who famously said that any journalist who has the sense to realize what he's doing knows that every act of journalism is an act of betrayal, is seduction and betrayal and so forth, and yet she admires this more than anyone, oddly enough. But anyway, well, listen, I thought I would read you a few more poems, because, oh yeah. If I can talk a little bit about writing in the I voice. Well, I mean, basically, I think we talked about this a little bit, but I will happily talk about it some more, which is that I very much, I think I told you I'm not interested in memoir, but I am interested in the I voice. And again, not out of megalomania, but out of modesty. And that doesn't mean you have to use the word I. Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc's book, Random Family, doesn't have the word I repeated it once, and yet it is such a voice. It is such a specific, the things that are noticed, page after page, are so distinctive and so distinctively idiosyncratic that you know that there's no attempt here to be doing God's eye's view of things. Every rule has exceptions, and there can be exceptions to this one, but generally speaking, I just favor specifically a voice, by the way. I think I mentioned that Sean used to say that he didn't hire reporters, he hired voices. That you could always teach a voice to report. So the voice that inhabits most newspapers, the voice of supposed objectivity, and I find to be extremely perverse and unhelpful, whereas on the contrary, a voice that breathes its idiosyncratic individuality and specifically its fallibility is much more powerful to me. Does that make sense? So, and then in terms of how you learn to write in the I voice, you learn it by reading. I should mention, by the way, that for those of you who were taking it, the thing that you printed out, if you were doing the printing out, was a shorter section of the longer class. The longer class is available. The book is called the reader is called The Fiction of Nonfiction, and that's a 14-week reader. And whether or not you're taking the class, the readings are just really the coolest things in it, including very early Joe Gould. I start the reader with extremely early Joe Gould columns, and end it with Joe Gould's Secret. But so anyway, it's available at the Village Copier on East 13th Street, and you just ask for that. But it has, I mean, the way you learn to write I voice, oddly enough, is by inhabiting other people's I voices. That great line that mediocre artists borrow, great artists steal. I think one of the things you've been noticing all through this class is I'm referring how people are taking other people's cadences. They're just ripping them off. And that's wonderful. I mean, I do it all the time. Yeah.
One of the lines, following up on your comment before that Tom Walton was talking about no property.
Uh-huh.
Do you consider any relationship between him and like David Foster Wallace?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Where does David Foster Wallace come from? Well, I mean, he's, for one thing, sui generis. I mean, he's just a comet of brilliance. But he is much more formally tight than Hunter Thompson is, for example. And I mean, at the end of the day, he's coming out of philosophy and mathematics, and probably I would argue, probably the biggest influence on him is Donald Barthelme, who in turn, the biggest influence was phenomenology. Obviously one of the most brilliant writers ever, and one of the things I think about him a lot is how absolutely horrified it must have been to have a mind like that turn on itself. I mean, the voice that you have in your head when you're feeling blue and when you're beating yourself up, well, that's one thing, but that to have David Foster Wallace, the dark shade of David Foster Wallace turning on you must have just been excruciating. Yeah.
Wait, let me think about when you were talking about the self-loathing and such.
Uh-huh. And by the way, do you feel the same thing in terms of acting, that you feel that self-loathing? Completely, you say, yeah.
Like, there's stage, there's the two things of like when you're not making something, but then there's all the other conditions, stage fright, which like is completely related to the impulse to perform, and also like sometimes like it is an emergency, like you
Uh-huh.
which is a bit extreme, but, you know, so, yeah.
Which is a personification of their own will to kill their own careers.
Yeah.
I mean, the fear that you might be assassinated is the fear that you'll assassinate yourself. It's also the great line of Kierkegaard about vertigo. Vertigo is not the fear of falling, it's the fear of jumping.
So what?
Vertigo is not the fear of falling, it's the fear of jumping. It's radical freedom. Why don't you jump? But having said that, it's not a question of laziness. By the way, in my own life, I've known somebody who is the most amazing experience of stage fright is Tom Lehrer, the singer, who was, in addition to being the great singer of the Vatican Rag and all those fantastic songs in the 60s, just incredible, one song after another, just breathtakingly brilliant songs, a wonderful performer, and suddenly was completely felled by writer's block. When he wasn't doing that, he was a math professor, and he was indeed my math professor at Santa Cruz. And during the McGovern campaign, he gave for the first time in 10 years, he gave a concert at college night, because the next night he was going to give a benefit for McGovern. And he managed to do it at college night among his fellows. And this was a huge, big deal, that Tom Lehrer coming out, giving it, was going to, for the first time in 10 years, and he couldn't do it. It was a catastrophe. And he just couldn't do it. And he didn't do it. But he's a Joe Gould Secret character. This happens probably more than you think, but it is striking.
I just thought that Sean was a creator of writing that. That probably great inspiration.
You feel that he was a creator of writers? How do you mean?
Well, I think he kept moving into space to the point of encouraging people to not write. To rewrite, to do things, to undo.
I wouldn't describe it that way, that he was constantly getting us to rewrite, or he didn't do that with me. My experience with Sean was that it was like being in psychoanalysis. You would go up to see Sean, and he would be totally decorous and polite and totally focused on you. He'd sit down and he'd all loud and total complete attention and just say yes, yes, and wonderful, yes, I think you should do that, yes, yes, yes. And then you'd get up and walk out and you'd break into cold sweats. I mean, when his eyebrow raised, did that mean he hated me? You know, it was exactly transverse like we did in psychoanalysis. And then conversely, under Gottlieb, it was just the opposite. Gottlieb was totally acting out all the time, and you had to be the one who was centered and quiet. And so with Gottlieb was just completely off the wall. So I, in my own experience of him, I didn't have that experience.
It's not just those two really great extreme examples, but it became less and less.
There were some, but there were many who weren't. There were some who became less and less prolific, but there were others who just the opposite, became more and more and thrived. Sandy Fraser, I mean, several of them we could talk about. I mean, Jamaica Kincaid, Fraser, Mark, and Mark is less so after Sean is gone. That younger generation, oddly enough, was thriving pretty nicely, I think. But,
I think the course, I don't know, is that what you described as the jewel inside the sanctum inside, or whatever?
Yeah.
Because I think we talked about how great it is to not have any more books in the world.
Yeah. That wasn't the part, but the thing about not bringing more books in the world, yeah.
About the long quotes.
Yeah.
Do you think he was speedwriting, taking down rules?
About the long quotes, I would suggest that he did. I have long quotes too, and I would suggest that what you do is you take notes for 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, and then when you sit down to write, you fashion the experience of what it is to be like, what it's like to be with the person, but you're taking pieces from all over the place, and I mean, one of the things I always say is that I have never in my life had a quote challenged. I have never in my life quoted anybody verbatim. I quote what people remember having said. Well, in your case, I did you, and
Didn't I thought that it was like, you know, argue the flattery portrait? The writer was corrected somewhere along the way.
Somebody once said that more or less all those lines that you don't that I make people sound better than they are, but I don't think I do that.
When you catch something of the cadence and certainly of the quality of, but you are making something really different than verbatim.
Absolutely.
And for those for whom verbatim is important, you're not doing it right. For me, I can't imagine if I look at each I have to listen to somebody.
So essentially, Art is saying that he writes in speech blues, so you have an exactly opposite problem. You have to take the long quote and. I was going to see here if I could find a different poem that I was going to read than the one I was going to read, but let me see if I can find it. Yeah. This is Jack Gilbert. Poetry is a kind of line. Poetry is a kind of line necessarily to profit the poet or beauty, but also in that truth may be told only so. Those who admirably refuse to falsify as those who will not risk pretensions are excluded from saying even so much. Degas said he didn't paint what he saw, but what would enable them to see the thing he had. You don't paint what you see, you paint what will enable people to see what you saw. Which is a difference. And I would argue parenthetically, if I had published the transcripts of our conversations, it wouldn't have sounded like our conversations. That I think that people who meet you after having read people said to me after I wrote that piece of you, yeah, you got him. That's what he's like. By the way, that's what he's like, not that's what he is. I don't tape record. No. And I don't give them my transcripts. Fuck you. Publish it or don't publish it. I don't mind you. By the way, one of the backups for me is that people are fact checked, so all the things in it are fact checked. In the New Yorker more thoroughly than other places. But transcripts, don't even get me started about transcripts.
But if they're fact checking your industry, they have to ask you.
No, they call the person. They call, in the case of Art, were you fact checked? That was Rolling Stone that I did that piece for, but.
I can't remember, but I know many times like I've done things with quotes in the New Yorker pieces, and my quotes were checked.
Yeah. Were they checked verbatim or the substance of the quote was checked? Usually it's yeah. And by the way, one thing I like doing is giving you the piece. I think I gave you the piece before it was published. Yeah, I have no problem with that.
So how does that tie in with Mitchell writing composite characters?
That's a whole other discussion with Mitchell writing composite characters. In certain cases, he acknowledges that he's doing it.
After the fact.
Well, old Mr. Flood, all that he says when he publishes the book that it is composites. That'll have to be a class. If you were taking the longer class, we get into that, which comes under the category. I have a whole class called Selected Phony Controversies.
One other thing that I wanted to mention about what I really liked about those long rivers of Gilbert's teaching.
Right.
He becomes another good writer than like
He becomes an
act of true ventriloquism.
Right.
He becomes another kind of good writer, even though he expresses great impatience with that writer.
Right. It is an oral history, paradoxically, that Gould becomes the writer he would have been, or could have been, and it wasn't lazy.
The version of Doodoo Journalism.
Yeah.
Like it was kind of one bohemian is replaced by this other kind.
Right. Anyway, folks, we're almost finished. I have a few poems I wanted to read you before you left because I didn't have time to get into these poems, but I'll read a few poems. And then we'll be done. One of them is, since it's baseball season, this is the poem for World Series, which starts on Wednesday. Robert Francis, the beat poet. I started with Gary Snyder, remember, and here's another beat poet for you, Robert Francis. who did a series of poems about each of the positions in baseball, the catcher, the first baseman, and so forth. And this one's called Pitcher. His art is eccentricity. His aim, how not to hit the mark he seems to aim at. His passion, how to avoid the obvious. His technique, how to vary the avoidance. The others throw to be comprehended. He throws to be a moment misunderstood, yet not too much. Not errant wild, but every seeming aberration willed. Not too, yet still to communicate, making the batter understand too late. I forget, did I read you the Thomas Transtromer Sentry Duty? I don't think I did. Did I read you? I haven't read that one. Okay. I will have now read to you a Philip Roth quote today and a Thomas Transtromer quote, and until either of them gets the Nobel Prize, it's not worth listening to who gets the Nobel Prize. Those are the two obvious people who should get Nobel Prizes, and it's a scandal. It's a flaming scandal. Thomas Transtromer is a great, great Swedish poet, and he'll never get it because he's Swedish. But he has a poem called Sentry Duty. It's based on the fact that if you're Swedish, you have to have a year's mandatory military service. You know, standing guard at the Finnish border or whatever it is that you have to do. And so this is a poem called Sentry Duty, translated by Robert Bly. I'm ordered out to a big hump of stones as if I were an aristocratic corpse from the Iron Age. The rest of them are still back in the tent sleeping, stretched out like spokes in a wheel. In the tent, the stove is boss. It's a big snake that swallows a ball of fire and hisses. But it's silent out here in the spring night among chill stones, waiting for the dawn. Out here in the cold, I can start to fly like a shaman straight to her body. Some places pale from her swimsuit. The sun shining right on us. The moss was hot. I brush along the side of warm moments, but I can't stay there long. I'm whistled back through space. I crawl among the stones, back to here and now. Task to be where I am. Even in this solemn and absurd role, I am still the place where creation does a little work on itself. Dawn comes. The sparse tree trunks take on color now. The frost-bitten forest flowers form a silent search party after something that has disappeared in the dark. But to be where I am and to stay. I'm full of anxiety, obstinate, confused. Things not yet happened are already here. I feel that. They're just out there. A murmuring mass outside the barrier. They can only slip in one by one. They want to slip in. Why? They do, one by one. I am the turnstile. And then the opposite poem, that poem saying that you have to be where you are and stay still and wait and listen for what's going to happen. And then the opposite poem is provided by Seamus Heaney. Thank God he at least got a Nobel Prize, or I'd have to say that he'd be another one of these people we have to wait for. But I'll close the talks with this poem, which in a way will blow away everything I've said so far, which is how you should end it, of course. Postscript. It's the last poem in his book, Spirit Level. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore. In September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, the surface of a slate-gray lake is lit by the earthen lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their full-grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. One sentence, that whole thing. Useless to think that you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there. A hurry through which known and strange things pass as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. So the one poem is all about how you have to be here and now, another one is how you're neither here nor there. And that's where you are. So thank you. So by the way, on Thursday night, there's this event that really is like the fifth class of this class, which is about two of the great nonfiction writers, Curzio Malaparte and Vasily Grossman. And then on Saturday is the Wonder Cabinet. All day long, just one cool thing after another. And the announcement